Welcome to AI with AI. That's Artificial Intelligence with Andy Lachinsky, a podcast from CNA Talks where we discuss the latest breakthroughs and implications in artificial intelligence and autonomy. We have an email address, ai@cna.org. If you have any questions or comments, just drop us a line, ai@cna.org. And if you're listening to us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, don't forget to check out our website where we will post all the links that we discussed today. That's cna.org/CAAI. Well, with that, Andy, what's the latest and greatest in artificial intelligence and autonomy?
Well, we have a lot of ground to cover. I mean, we've been, off the air for a few weeks, so it's going to be a mix of stuff that was in the queue, I guess, in the beginning part of December, although we have a couple of newer items as well.
Yeah, there's a lot going on.
Yeah, let's jump right in. So speaking of what happened in December, so when I was putting the notes together, it was the third week in December. The Senate had just approved the FY22 National Defense Authorization Act.
Right.
Since then, about a week later, President Biden actually signed the defense policy on December 27th. So it's $768 billion, and it contains actually a fairly large number of provisions that directly impinge on AI and various emerging technologies. First one of which, I'm not going to read the whole list, but remember back on podcast, I think it was 4.35 back in July of last year, we talked about how Deputy Defense Secretary Kathleen Hicks, she announced a new AI and Data Acceleration Initiative. And so one of the things in the bill is about $57 million for that. Another provision, Section 226 for those following, it'll require a review of artificial intelligence applications and establishment of performance metrics with several very key milestones within 180 days of the NDAA. The Secretary of Defense has to identify the objectives for the incorporation of AI applications in the platforms, processes, operations of DoD. A lot of performance objectives and metrics have to be set for like skill gaps of civilian and military personnel, exercises, war games, logistics. I mean, it runs the gamut. The bill also creates, this is Section 226, a pilot program to establish data repositories to facilitate development of AI capabilities for DoD. We've talked a number of times on the podcast on the new AI-focused Joint Common Foundation program, the cloud-based AI development experimentation platform managed by Jake. So there are a couple of modifications that the bill is going to require, including actions to increase the number of commercial AI companies that are eligible to provide support to DoD, and authorizes DoD to expand the efforts of the Defense Innovation Unit to engage again with industry and communities to accelerate various technology adoption. And there are a number of others. The other one of them that caught my eye was it kind of stipulates now and puts provisions on what DoD must do to establish, quote, the executive education activities on emerging technologies for select officers and civilian staff. So what's interesting is that within 5 years, the program will be mandatory for all general flag officers and senior executive level civilian leaders. So DoD is getting serious, and it's good. I mean, that's exactly what ought to be happening. And a bunch of other stuff, including like obviously the National Security Commission on AI with its final report last year. Now it's kind of official within this new bill that DoD has to provide regular reports and briefings to Congress on how it's implementing the sets of recommendations made in that very, very long list of stuff that came out of the National Security Commission. And there are a couple of others. The full NDAA is arm-busting 3,300 pages, but they'll provide a couple of links, a kudos and a shout-out to Stanford University Institute for Human-Centered AI Center. They published a really nice summary of the specific AI provisions that are in the bill. So for those of you who want to kind of cut to the chase really quickly, you can look at that. And there's also a 20-page summary of the bill itself that we'll provide a link to. But lots of stuff in there, lots of meat.
Yeah, that's great. A mere 3,300 pages. That barely holds a candle to the number of pages we use for the podcast notes. But
yeah, but that's over a course of a year.
But I will say, I guess a lot of these things will fall to the new Chief Data and AI Officer that's been established, right? If you recall, that memo just came out late last year.
Right.
And I believe the organizations involved are currently reorganizing over the next couple months. So more to follow there, but presumably, the Secretary of Defense is the belly button, so to speak, for a lot of these. That will likely get delegated to that individual, the Chief Data and AI Officer. At least we shall see.
A couple of other developments at the tail end of last year in the context of AI and other related technologies kind of diffusing their way outward into the social milieu, as it were. So the first story is from the Federal Trade Commission, specifically the FTC's chair, Lina Khan. She sent an open letter, very short, to the point, to Senator Richard Blumenthal. He's a Democrat from Connecticut. And it outlined her goals that now everybody can kind of peek under the hood and see for themselves what it's all about, to protect American citizens from unfair or deceptive practices online. And in particular, the FTC is considering rulemaking to address lax security practices, I'm quoting from the letter, data privacy abuses, and algorithmic decision making that may result in unlawful discrimination. Now, it's interesting, the FTC it does have a rulemaking authority, but the wording apparently is very specific. There's Section 18 of the FTC Act. It enables the FTC to issue lots of like trade regulations as long as certain conditions are met, including one where the commission has reason to believe and it can demonstrate that the practices to be addressed by the rulemaking are prevalent. And why that interesting word prevalent is important is because even though we see rampant abuses in the press, it's actually not an easy thing to point to and demonstrate, partly because companies are not very keen on sharing information, right, about their algorithms. So they kind of have to make sure that they meet this condition of prevalency before they can act under rulemaking authority. So it's interesting to see how much will actually result from this. But at the very least, we're getting a glimpse of what the FTC is thinking of doing in this regard.
We saw earlier, I guess it was right, the European Commission coming out with some pretty hard line rules and regulations on what they thought was going to be necessary. And if I recall correctly, right, that got a response from the Secretary of the Treasury
Mm-hmm.
or someone from the Treasury Department that was basically worried about the European Commission getting ahead of the curve on regulation. So now here we finally have the FTC stepping up to the plate to be part of the dialogue. So I guess we'll see where it goes from here.
Right. Well, and that's a nice segue because the European Commission is, in a sense, leapfrogging once again. So, actually, a little bit before this letter came out, the letter came out on the 21st of December. About a week and a half earlier, the European Commission came out, and again, it's following a string of related kind of deliberations and various things coming out of them. The European Commission has come out with 3 items: a communication setting out the EU approach and measures on platform work, web-based platforms, like work is outsourced through an open call to some geographically dispersed crowd like Amazon Mechanical Turk, location-based applications where you have apps that allocate work to individuals and so on. So what the European Commission has done is they put out a communication that kind of describes this, a proposal for a directive on what specific measures have to be made to improve the working conditions in platform work. Very specific. And it's not a short directive. It's like 50 pages or 44 pages or so. And then draft guidelines of clarifying kind of the application of EU competition law to collective agreements of solo self-employed people seeking to improve their working conditions. There's a lot of meat here too. In many ways, it far surpasses kind of the current spate of deliberations like from the FTC. So in a sense, yet again, the European Commission, I think, is arguably ahead of the curve here. But collectively, what's fascinating, right? Think back only 2-3 years ago. There's a market increase in the level of, I don't want to use the word sophistication because I'm not quite sure that's right, but there are a lot of very deep in the weeds subtleties that are finally being addressed. These are long in the making, and it's nice to see finally emerge.
So now, if I'm reading this correctly, the European Parliament and Council will have to still adopt this proposal, but once they do, or if they do, member states will then have 2 years to put that into action. Is that correct?
Yeah, nothing
Okay.
fast is happening, but the deliberations are definitely on track. And again, for those of you interested in peeking behind the hood, you're welcome to do so.
We'll take a short break and we'll be right back.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sebastian Bay, a research analyst with CNA's gaming program. Our team designs games to address problems in a wide range of scenarios, from the battlefield to the classroom and everywhere in between. We design bespoke war games specific to your organization's needs, and we draw upon the diverse talent at CNA to bring you the best product possible. If you're interested in learning more about our work, please visit our website at cna.org/wargaming.
So we're moving on, I guess, in time. What recently was held, this is, in fact, a couple of days ago, it concluded the Consumer Electronics Show 2022, which apparently was held
Hmm.
partly in person, right? Probably for the
Hmm.
first time in a year or two. This was in Las Vegas. And so part of what was unveiled there is something that I had originally in the notes back in December. So what am I talking about? There's a UK company called Engineered Arts, and it's just one of many that make robots. And we've talked about a whole bunch of
Hmm.
robots, right, on the podcast in the intervening years. So this one really kind of takes the cake in many ways. It's a fascinating glimpse into how the technology, just of the physical appearance, if not yet the innards, because we're far from, a science fiction. Here's a robot that's walking and
Hmm.
talking and interacting with you. But Engineered Arts introduced a new robot, gray-faced, humanoid, hairless,
Hmm.
called Ameka, and it was introduced very short on a short Twitter on December 9th, and that's what kind of caught my eye. And almost immediately upon that release, Elon Musk famously responded with a single word tweet, "Yikes!" And you'll understand why when you go to this. But there are a couple of interesting things here. So it was unveiled, as I said, this past week. There's a nice little video where you can see kind of an interaction with the Meek. It's about 8 or 9 minutes long, and it's
Hmm.
really worth watching. And there's a nice review of Ameka on the CNET site that we'll provide a link to, because there are interesting snippets with the director of
Hmm.
operations, Morgan Rowe, who talks about the development of the robot. But what was fascinating to me, and it's part of what Morgan Rowe said in the interview, is that on the one hand, it is arguably among the most realistic robots, certainly in
Hmm.
terms of physical motion, that I've seen in a long time. But again, I emphasize there's no hair and it's a
Hmm.
translucent plastic skull. And that was done deliberately. And this is according to Morgan Rowe, that when they had put together behind the scenes what they were and are capable of, this is Morgan Rowe speaking now, it actually looked a little bit
Hmm.
too sinister, and it encroached unhealthily into the uncanny valley that we've talked about. So they deliberately
Hmm.
pulled it backwards to make it seem both more
Hmm.
realistic and less. And I won't go on and on because of the interest of time here, but I encourage everybody to just go and take a look at this, because it does show how the art is
Hmm.
progressing. We're nowhere near, as the director of operations himself says, this is not going to be, a whiz bang robot that's sitting and eating with
Hmm.
you and interacting with you. And thankfully, Amika's AI, if one can even call it that, is certainly
Hmm.
no better
Right.
than Alexa's at the moment. But it is a glimpse into what is coming down the pike 5, 10, 15 years from now.
I took a look at the video, and yeah, it's pretty funny to watch the facial expressions. You can kind of tell, right? It's like, okay, it's running a subroutine now that's like a board, or kind of looking around, or
Mhm.
I'm going to move around and stretch a little bit. But it's still great to see, like you said, where the state of the art is on this technology. I thought one quote about expecting it to take at least 10 years before a robot is quote unquote walking amongst us as a service robot, still being a bit optimistic, shall we say? So
Well, that's always a moving target, right? Whenever you ask anybody, it's always 10, 15 or
always
so.
10 years, right?
But it's fascinating. Please, everybody, take a look. I mean, it's really neat.
Yeah.
And the last quick news story, just because we have to start the year with a Darpa program, right? But it's kind of neat.
Yep.
So DARPA has a new program. It's called Amigos, Autonomous
Yeah.
Multimodal Ingestion for Goal-Oriented Support. And it's part of the Perceptually Enabled Task Guidance Program. What are we talking about? It's about a $6 million contract that Park, the lead
Hmm.
contractor, a Xerox company, obviously. So the basic idea is to develop an AI system that will extract like task information from the old way of how things are disseminated and documented, text, illustrations, and videos, and use augmented reality guidance based on it. $6 million, not huge by any stretch, and it's not unique, obviously. Like Lockheed Martin, for example, has been using augmented reality goggles for its space programs that it does for NASA. But it's an interesting use of the technology, and I'd be interested to see what comes of it.
Yeah, I could certainly see the need, right? You mentioned that there's already augmented reality technologies
Right,
like this,
right.
but the idea of this would be, hey, we've got lots of old material in textbooks and, like you said, videos. It'd be great if we could just dump that into something that can then automatically shuffle it into an augmented reality system. I will be very curious how well this really works, because there's so much, as we often discuss, there's
Sure.
so much information buried in these things that assume certain amounts of human knowledge in these programs. So how do you create a system, an augmented reality system, that can deal with those those things that are left unsaid in an automatic fashion
Oh,
and
sure.
without having to have huge amounts of people in the loop cleaning the information. So obviously color me very, very skeptical, but very interested because it would be huge if they could really get this to work well.
Yeah, I mean, it really does seem like two programs in one. That
Mm,
first one is by no means a solved problem that you just
hmm.
described. I mean,
Yeah.
forget the augmented reality part. Even if you were to start with a clean slate and everything is done specifically to facilitate the augmented reality way of displaying and training, that's still an enormous task. So yeah, but we'll see what happens.
Maybe they can couple it to Glide, which we'll be talking about later, to help with the weird things, right? We'll
Might
see.
help. So let's jump into research. So this caught my eye, not in an AI paper, not in a machine learning venue, but this was from Physical Review E, which every once in a while I look at the abstracts, given my physics background. And I was really fascinated to see this was published on 3rd of January, documenting research that is done at Bar Ilan University in Israel, which, if I read correctly, overturns about a century's worth of conventional wisdom, or at least some of it, about how basic neurons work.
Hmm.
We've had a few papers like that in the last 2 years, right? Where kind of breaking research techniques allow us to peer ever deeper into how real neurons work.
Hmm.
What caught my eye here is not only does it overturn a lot of the conventional wisdom, but in an interesting way that the researchers themselves say that, this really could have been discovered using technology we've had since the 1980s.
Hmm.
And the supposition is that it's only because of the ingrained nature of conventional wisdom that
Hmm.
people really haven't looked at it. So, what am I talking about? The basic idea of a neuron, this is what we've believed for decades and decades. And this fundamental idea hasn't changed, of course. It's an excitable element, right? You have electrical signals coming in from whatever neurons are connected to it.
Hmm.
A neuron produces some short electrical pulse, a
Hmm.
spike,
Yep.
once a threshold is crossed. And after it does so, it kind of rests in what's called a refractory state
Hmm.
that lasts about 2 or 3 milliseconds,
Hmm.
during which you can't really generate another spike. And then after some stuttering time, it gets back to its initial action. And then yet again, it waits for more signals to come in and cross the threshold. Well,
Hmm.
what these researchers document is basically three things are very different from how we believe them to be. The duration of this resting time, the refractory time, can not only exceed the 20 milliseconds, which was the absolute top that people believe could happen, about 10 times longer
Hmm.
than previously assumed. So that's
Hmm.
number one. The refractory periods can even be longer than that,
Hmm.
depending on what preceding neuronal activity was taking place.
Interesting.
The resting period itself is sensitive on the origin of the input signal.
Hmm.
Literally, neurons that are stimulated from different directions
Hmm.
have different refractory periods. That apparently was simply not known.
Hmm.
People had the capacity to measure it, but for some reason they didn't. I mean, we're talking about really basic stuff here.
Yeah.
And the idea of the stuttering period of neuronal responses that follows the refractory time is also put into dispute, where these more precise measurements show that, in fact, there are very sharp transitions from the refractory period to the full responsiveness period without an intermediate stutter phase. There are two immediate applications. The first one, it actually may help in uncovering certain, like, degenerative diseases within the brain. It's called kind of, or at least re-examine them, that you have a framework now, at least, for beginning to think about or ask about, well, if neurons respond differently from left or right, and we have lots of degenerative diseases that in part hinge on that, well, this gives a
Hmm.
new mechanism to look at. And of course, it
Hmm.
opens up potentially new horizons for, yet again, re-examining deep learning algorithms vis-a-vis how they either match or try to mimic what we know about how real brains do what they do. By the way, we'll have some related stories on that. So I just found this absolutely fascinating. Number one, it pushes the envelope in terms of what we understand about neurons, but it does so in a way that when you look at what was done, this easily could have been done decades ago, but
Yeah.
wasn't.
Yeah. Now, also interesting, right? It all kind of makes sense as well, at least with that anisotropic aspect, that the signal direction coming in can result in something different going out,
Mhm.
right? I mean, these are three-dimensional objects;
Yeah.
they exist in a three-dimensional environment, so it stands to reason that that sensitivity to location actually matters. But like you said, right, that opens up just a whole new realm of possibilities and ways of thinking about this. Very cool.
And it was in Physical Review E.
Yeah,
It's
of all
not in a
places.
neuroscience paper or a journal. It's not in a machine learning journal.
Hmm.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So the second story, again, easy to describe, but wow, it is so just filled with philosophical depth even. So this is a preprint, so it hasn't been peer-reviewed as far as I know, and this is work done at Victoria University in Melbourne, Australia. And what the researchers did is they developed something called dish brain, which we've talked about a variety of different venues. Researchers play with various brain cells, right? That mini brains, right? For a variety of purposes and varying degrees of whatever it is that they're doing. So what these researchers did is they took between 800,000 and a million living brain cells. Some were mouse cells taken from embryonic brains. Others have human brain cells derived from stem cells. Again, nothing particularly different from what was done before, except what they did with it and what they discovered by doing so. So what they do is they take these cells and they grow them on top of microelectrode arrays that act as elements that stimulate the cells and they can read their activity. So the first interesting thing is just that, is that they have an experimental framework in which you have living brain cells and a mechanism to simultaneously allow them to kind of make sense of the environmental information around them and to act on their environment. So what did they do? They made, or they induced, is perhaps a better way of saying, these clusters of brain cells to essentially play a baby version of Pong. Remember the old Pong game? This was the first computer game I was exposed to when I was like 10 years old, way back when, right?
Like 2D ping pong, right?
Right. Yeah. This is a really simplified game of Pong. There's literally no opponent, but bear with me. So remember, these cells are sitting on these microelectrode arrays. So the electrodes, they're firing on left or right of one array, and they tell the mini brain, which think of now as a paddle, whether the ball is on the left or right. So the frequency of the signals indicates closeness. Specific patterns of activity across the neurons are interpreted as a paddle moving left or right. And the computer responds to this activity, and there's feedback via the electrodes. Now, you might be asking yourself, what do you mean they're playing Pong? That, to me, is the core interest of this whole enterprise.
Right.
What it really is the first experiment that kind of probes an idea that people have been writing about for many, many years now, called the free energy principle. The idea, in terms of understanding how the brain does what it does, the key idea is that neurons, whether they're in a brain or a petri dish, they are continually trying to create an internal model of their external world. So I'm going to anthropomorphize a bit, but in a sense, what the free energy principle consists of is that it's an idea whereby we view neurons or the brain as a whole as a mechanism that simply wants to predict what will happen in terms of whatever it is it's aware of and what inputs it has to the environment, and wants to minimize its degree of surprise. And so the first and most important lesson of what these guys did is, in a sense, just by instantiating these brain cells and the fact that they did anything at all, it's already kind of very consistent with the free energy principle. They are literally playing the game. The authors refer to it as they by fiat, are living in the matrix, whether they know it or understand it or not. And they believe themselves to be the paddle, which is our interpretation. What they're doing is continually predicting what's happening around them vis-a-vis these electrical signals, either left or right. That's absolutely fascinating. Now, the other fascinating thing is that they discovered that these cells, which, remember, they consist both of mouse cells and of human brains, they learned to play the game profoundly faster than any AI we have. 5 minutes of real time, and they needed about 10 or 15 of these Pong rallies, compared to a typical computer-based machine learning algorithm, which needs at least about 5,000. That in itself is fascinating. There's something ingrained in the natural fabric of these brain cells that just by existing, they do what the free energy principle kind of hypothesizes real brains do, and they do it remarkably faster than right now our machine learning algorithms.
Yeah, and I think it's important to highlight, right? Because I saw this pop up on a lot of feeds, and they all said they learn much faster than AIs. And I'm sure the first thing that popped into everyone's mind, time. And while that's sort of true, the more important thing again is the number of attempts.
Right.
And that's the real profound difference here. And it further highlights one of the many gaps that we still have with the technology, the neural networks that we're using today. So very, very fascinating.
Yeah, really, really cool. So next research, again, we're still sticking with neuroscience for a bit. This is in the beginning of November. This was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, a work done at MIT. And it's profoundly neuroscience here and a direct measurement of and a comparison of how our, in this case, in the context of language, how our kind of state of the art machine learning algorithms for language understanding, how do they compare with what brains really do? And by what brains really do, I mean either functional magnetic resonance imaging or intracranial electroencephalograms. And so what the researchers did, it's kind of, they cobbled together something a little bit over 40 different artificial neural net language models, including those kind of at both ends of the spectrum. Some were really, really simple, basic embedding models. Others are literally on the GPT level. So, and everything in between. And the researchers presented a set of stimuli, and by stimuli, I mean sentences, passages. In fact, they used entire stories for part of the research. So they presented the same set of stimuli to the various models, and again, they had over 40 of them. And then they presented it to humans, and they recorded both the model's internal activations and from the fMRI and the IEEGs, what the humans were doing as they were assimilating this information. And what they looked at was the model's internal representations along three major dimensions: the ability to predict human neural representations. And by that, I literally mean the ability to predict the activity in the frontotemporal language network in the brain that was identified in the previous study. So they're literally comparing and correlating what the predictive ability is of a particular machine learning model in terms of its internal machinations, literally the activation levels of its hidden layers, with what the brain is doing while performing the same task. And that was using the prior study's brain score. That's the first dimension. Second dimension is predicting human behavior, in this case in the form of reading times as a proxy for the comprehension difficulty of whatever language task is being tested. And finally, the ability to perform computational tasks like next word prediction. And they came up with really interesting findings. Remember, what's happening here is a direct comparison of a broad class of machine learning models in the context of language understanding and processing, and how the human brain physiologically does pretty much the same thing. So the first thing they found is some of the models predict neural data extremely well. And they identified the GPT model variants as the most brain-like, which is interesting because it shows that even though we can make fun of the deficiencies of the GPT model, to the extent that both they and the human brain rely on prediction, because remember, that's how they work, right? You're basically predicting another word given whatever key you're given, right? That seems to be the core underlying similarity between our best models in the language domain and how human brains work. Also, interestingly, as you and I have commented and others have seen, the GPT models, they start falling apart, right? When you're looking at longer kind of aggregated strings where it's no longer a case of just reading a sentence, but now you're looking for correlations and meaning that is diffused throughout a paragraph, multiple paragraphs, right? Then the GPT models kind of fall apart. And indeed, they find in situations where there are longer text and stories that were shown to the subjects, all the neural network models that they tested fared relatively poorly in comparison to how they scored on the short range text. So that wasn't very surprising, but it's interesting that it came out in the study quite naturally. Then when they tested various language tasks on 8 different benchmarks using the GLUE benchmark, the General Language Understanding Evaluation, I think we talked about it in various other contexts, they found that none of the models that they tested correlated. So even if these models do well on the tasks, it doesn't predict at all how they're going to fare in terms of being able to match what the brain is really doing. Prediction seems to be something special. So that's rather interesting.
Yeah.
And then the last thing, and I'll stop here, is that the more brain-like an AI model is, the more it's able to match human behavior, in this case, the subject's individual reading time. So again, that part I don't think is all that surprising. Kind of comprehensibility seems to track in terms of how the machine learning algorithms process the language inputs and how the human brain processes it. So there are limited conclusions. Some of them I find fascinating, like the prediction seems to be the only one that's highly correlated, and that there's very little correlation, as one of these findings shows, that even when they do well in the tasks, it doesn't really demonstrate at all that they're mimicking anything the brain is doing. But it's one of a rare set of papers that tackles that question directly.
Right. Oh, that's great.
The last quick research, and it really is quick because it's basically a comparison to a model or models that we talked about, about a year ago, I think, on podcast 4.14. So this has to do with image generation. Remember back then we talked about kind of a coupled set of machine learning algorithms, one called DALI and the other called CLIP. CLIP was trained by learning to predict which caption from a random selection of like 32,000 is a correct one for a given image. And DALI, which combines Salvador Dali and Pixar's WALL-E, remember?
Right,
It
right.
uses a version of GPT-3 trained to generate images from text descriptions. So this new system put out by OpenAI, this was at the tail end of December, called GLIDE, that stands for Guided Language to Image Diffusion for Generation and Editing. And it's noteworthy for two reasons. First, it pretty much does what DALI does, but it takes it a couple of steps further, but it's based not on generative adversarial networks, but on diffusion models. Diffusion models, in a nutshell, they're kind of inspired by non-equilibrium thermodynamics. They define Markov chains, stochastic models, right, that kind of model a sequence of possible events in which the probability of a given event only depends on the state of the previous event. Right. So what the diffusion models do is they use a Markov chain of diffusion steps that slowly add random noise to data, and then they learn to reverse the diffusion to kind of construct the desired data samples from the noise. Right. I think there are at least one or two stories that we talked about that used that basic idea. This is very much part of GLIDE, but so they replace the old process that DALI used with the diffusion, but they also make it a bit more sophisticated where you can now add and layer a variety of different text-to-image generation steps to essentially yield what is akin to an image editing process, where you can jumpstart the process by having what the DALI used to do, and Glide does now considerably better. So create something like you use a phrase, a cozy living room, and you instantly have some instance that more often than not looks like a real living room. And by the way, from a comparative point of view, the samples that you'll see in the paper, and I urge our listeners to look at it because it has lots and lots of really fun examples to look at. When they asked a group of people to compare the DALI's outputs to GLIDE, 87% of the time, the samples, at least evaluated for photorealism, those are coming from GLIDE. And when they were evaluated for caption similarity, 69% of the time, it was deemed better than DALI. But beyond that, the image editing part that I want to get back to, so you have a cozy living room, you literally sit with this program and you say, well, I want a painting of a dog on the wall, or I want a round coffee table. Well, I'd like the coffee table, but put a vase of flowers. And you have these interactive sequential steps where you're doing nothing but very quickly interacting with this behind the scenes image generator, text to image generator program, and it becomes a quite powerful editing environment. To be sure, it's not perfect. And kind of on a meta level, it's interesting to probe where it fails. And the researchers give lots of funny examples of what they call unusual scenarios, where you ask for things that truly must be very sparse in the space, right? So for example, if you ask something like a car with triangular wheels, we can easily imagine it. Well, Glide has a little bit of difficulty with it, and there are a couple of other examples. So again, I don't want to spend too much time on this other than the state of the art just keeps getting pushed forward. And indeed, when you sit with this, it's a remarkably powerful system for what it does, pitfalls aside.
Yeah, it's funny where it fails, like that example you give, but the examples it seems to still succeed at, like a high quality oil painting of a psychedelic hamster dragon, seems to work, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
weird combinations seem to work, but then some other more practical ones, like the triangular wheels, doesn't. So kind of fascinating in some of the space of what is possible
Yeah,
and what isn't.
yeah.
But
It's
very cool. Definitely check out the pictures.
very cool. Two quick call outs before we call it a day. The first one is a really neat compilation of papers put out by the Santa Fe Institute that is basically chartered to study complex systems, the dynamics of complex systems. And they have something like 60 members of the Institute who put together not a short book, it's about 800 pages, but thankfully it's very, very cheap to obtain. It's essentially $3 as an ebook on Amazon. So kudos for them for the making it not a very expensive volume. And what it is, and it's written for a general audience, it kind of collectively shows you the, dare I say, the complexity of the pandemic. And by that I mean, clearly we've seen an impact and we continue seeing it everywhere from the local level to the global, international, planetary scale level. And remember, this is from the Santa Fe Institute, so they're applying their particular expertise, which is the dynamics of how complex systems behave. And they're taking that expertise and they're using it and leveraging it to provide a general audience. So you're not going to find too many equations here, but you will have a lot of wisdom sitting behind the scenes. How, if we look at this pandemic through the lens of complex systems theory, might we understand it better and perhaps deal with future pandemics as they may arise? It's a fascinating volume. As I say, it's a fairly cheap price of admission, $3. So for those of you interested in that perspective, there's really no better place to go to.
All right.
And finally, here is the whimsical video of the week. Those of you who are old enough, I was born in 1960, so a little bit after a 1958 movie came out called Vertigo, directed by Alfred Hitchcock. And I think Vertigo itself starred James Stewart. He was some police detective that was forced into early retirement because there was some accident that caused him to develop acrophobia and vertigo, hence the title of the film. So an artist named Chris Peters, he used an AI system, more precisely two of them, one that looked at the footage of vertigo and another one that created the narration for it. And there's almost no detail about it. It's more an artistic effort than a research one. And what little information is available, you can find when you go to the link to the YouTube site that houses this video. It's only about 5 minutes long. But what you will see is a short film from the perspective of an AI that has digested the real film. And I know you've seen it, so I'll turn it over to you to give your impressions on what you think the film does and does not do.
It's really funny because I didn't know what to expect going in, right? But Andy, what is one of the most key things you think when you think about the movie Vertigo?
Well, something that induces a sense of vertigo.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, right. Hitchcock had those very, impressive scenes where all the cinematics, right? When you're getting that sense of the height and right, very dramatic. None of that is in the short film, right? Instead, you're treated to what looks like maybe occasional snapshots from the movie, except they're very blurry and like chalky, blowing in the wind, kind of morphing, kind of look like people, but not really. You'll see snippets of, for instance, the Golden Gate Bridge, which also features prominently in the movie. You'll see echoes of it, and it just kind of flows from one image and thing to the other. It's pretty, it's quote unquote artistic. And then over it, they've overlaid a narration that was apparently generated by a separate AI who's talking through the whole thing. And I'll be honest, right? It's like everything else we've seen from a GPT-3 or whatever. Snippets of it make sense, but the whole arc of it is pretty much incomprehensible. Elements sound kind of deep, but then again, you try to track it through the whole narration and it makes zero sense. So all in all, it's just a very fascinating thing to watch. I mean, I enjoyed the whole sequence, and I don't think I saw any snippet of Kim Novak, right? From all the blurry
I didn't
figures,
see
right?
that,
it was always the male image, which is also kind of a fascinating.
So we had the earlier prediction with the robot Amecas, right?
Yeah.
By 10 years, we'll have the robot. The filmmaker's statement about Vertigo included the idea that by 2050, we'll be able to turn on our TV and order a machine to write and render a new show just in real time.
Yeah.
It may not come, and I guess it's also a nice illustration of the cliche that current day practice, state of the art, is still missing the forest for the trees.
Yeah, I would agree on that one.
But it's a fun film. It's 5 minutes. It's not going to cost you all that much time, and it's fun to watch.
It's worth checking out.
And that'll do it for this week.
All right. Well, if you're listening to us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, don't forget to check out our website where we will post all the links that we discussed today. And there's a lot of fun ones this week with a lot of great images. So check them out. That's cna.org/CAAI. But everyone, welcome our new computer overlords. Thanks as always, Andy. I'll see you next time.
Sounds good.